the worship wars. Those sound exciting.
It's not just a question of should we play Bethel or Hillsong, or should we sing a hymn? It's also a question of what is the point? What is like most important about us being gathered together? Who is this for?
You're talking to us about contemporary worship. How do you define contemporary worship?
Yeah, so I want to talk about contemporary worship in the sense of a particular movement and kind of a confluence of movements. There's a trend from like the middle of the 20th century all the way to the 1990s called contemporary worship that is more focused on not necessarily the style of worship, whatever is contemporary at that moment, but is more interested theologically in saying it's important that Christian worship reflects contemporary taste or interest. There's an evangelistic element to it. It's important that when people walk in our churches, they recognize the style of music and dress and the way that we build our buildings, those kinds of things. But then alongside that, from the mid 20th century to the 90s, separately, they kind of converge in the 90s when the worship wars are happening. But prior to that, it's kind of existing somewhat separately, is something people called praise and worship, which was, again, actually kind of a specific theological movement and much more charismatic, coming out of Pentecostal churches, and had a different reason for why it was so focused on a particular style of worship. Contemporary worship is saying whatever's contemporary is something we might need to consider adopting as an evangelistic tool. Praise and worship has this whole longer history for how they get to this place, but has a theology that says God inhabits the praise of his people. And so the central thing for a church service is worship music, not worship in other forms that we might do corporately, but it's music. Praise is musical. And it's important then that we kind of center much of our corporate life together around praising God so that God will be present with us, and that we have outward and physical expressions of that praise as an act of asking God to be with us. So that stream, less interested in are we singing the most contemporary songs in the sense of whatever's, in style at the moment, but very interested in kind of outward physical responses to worship music, and worship music being more central to the corporate gathering than it had been in the past in Christian history. Both of those kind of existing separately, and then in the 90s converging to combine to kind of say there's a little bit of this theology that says God inhabits the praises of his people, and so it's important that we sing so that God is present with us. And the way that we do that actually is evangelistic, and it needs to be in the form of music that is recognizable to people in this moment. So people use like all of these different words. Sometimes people use CCM, which technically really should be just referring to the kind of like performed music and the industry, as opposed to the theology in particular churches about what music they're using. But all of that, by the time you get to the 90s, it is kind of a mess. Like people do start using a variety of terms to talk about basically churches that both make music central to their corporate worship and very often are prioritizing worship music that sounds like whatever is contemporary at their time.
Okay, so it's kind of funny talking to you about this because you're coming at it as a historian.
Yeah.
And like studying it as a trend and as a theology and as a movement and what happened. And I'm thinking about it as like, this is what I lived. I experienced this. So let me share a little bit about my experience in the 90s. The 90s was also sort of the pinnacle of the church growth movement. Yes. Right? It had kind of incubated in the 70s, really taken off in the 80s, and it climaxed in the 90s. And overwhelmingly, the church growth voices emphasize the importance of contemporary music. And I think looking back on it, I think they knew it was important, and they knew it attracted an audience, and they knew it was a way to get religious consumers into their buildings, and they needed a theology to justify it.
Yeah.
Like they knew it worked as a business strategy, as a marketing strategy, but they needed some theology to justify it deeper than just it's getting people in the doors or people like the music. And I forget his name. There was a worship leader at Willow Creek who kind of became an apologist for contemporary worship, and not in a negative way. Like he was making the case for why this was important. And he talked a lot about the heart language, engaging God with your heart language. I don't know if you've encountered that.
Yep.
So the idea is that any person or culture, it's a little bit like the reason you translate the Bible into vernacular languages.
It's contextualization.
It's contextualization.
Yeah.
And his argument was when people gather for church, it's to express themselves to God and to worship him. And it's a heart-driven activity. It's an emotional activity. Yeah. And therefore it should be expressive in an emotional style that is indigenous to that culture, to that community. And he was saying, this is the baby boomers when they're in their 30s and 40s. They're saying they grew up on rock and roll music and drums and guitar. They didn't grow up with organs and, whatever. So the heart language for baby boomers was contemporary style music. And so that's what they ought to do. And that became the theological framework for what was, I think, a really savvy marketing strategy for church growth. Now you brought in the Pentecostal thing, the praise and worship thing, which is a really interesting, like, sacramental angle on it, which says, no, this music's important because the presence of God himself inhabits this music when we sing it. And it's now, I think, just overshadowed everything else. Like, I'm not hearing the church growth argument anymore. I'm not hearing the heart language argument anymore. I am hearing the sacramental argument that you need this emotive musical experience because that's where God is.
There is a real difference between saying, in a more Pentecostal context, the point of us gathering corporately is for God to inhabit the praises of God's people. The focus is the people who are believers, versus a different ecclesiology, a fancy word for our theology about the church. It's a very different ecclesiology to say, actually, what is fundamental, and a lot of the church growth folks and seeker-sensitive people would say this, especially when it comes to worship music, the goal of the gathered community is evangelistic. Right. We are here to reach people. Those are very different things, but they all get mixed up in the books that we publish and the music and all of that. And so I think it's important, especially for people who might be evaluating their own, whether it's your present context or your past context, thinking about what it meant and how to think about it well now, or what you might want to seek out in a church today, to think through those kinds of questions. It's not just a question of, should we play Bethel or Hillsong would be the question today, or should we play Chris Tomlin or whatever, or should we sing a hymn? It's also a question of, what is the point? What is, like, most important about us being gathered together? Who is this for? And it might be that there's multiple, of course there are multiple goals, but how do they relate to one another, and what are we trying to do? And then the question of what best facilitates what we're trying to do.